My experiment was to create 5 scenes from scratch in After Effects. I was trying to achieve the most realistic version of each scene as possible, so it would look like you were really seeing a shot of them in a film. I also wanted to experiment with different techniques in After Effects, testing out different colour grading methods and assembly techniques such as rotoscoping and overlaying, to see which would result in the best effects. In Maria Promagiora and Tom Wallace's book, Film, A Critical Introduction, I read that to help orientate viewers at the opening of a film, filmmakers often impart a great deal of information in a relatively short period of screen time. This is what I intended to do in my scenes, to try and show the audience exactly what type of landscape I was trying to portray in clips under 20 seconds long. This is the result of my experiment. The first scene I created was an underwater scene. We made this in a lecture as a class, and it is what triggered my interest in After Effects, and I wanted to create more of these scenes. We used some layers from ED films to create the underwater effect, and after the lecture I went and watched some of their films, which gave me some inspiration of what to create next. When colour grading, I took out some of the red colour from the layers, as red is the colour that fades quickest underwater, so it made it look more realistic. I also used the curtain filter with a screen effect to create light rays underwater. This effect worked well as the light rays moved with the water, making it feel like a part of the scene. I became interested in how light may be affected by different scenes and decided to make this a focus in my next experiments, as I felt how I portrayed lighting was important in making the scene look realistic. I also used a QCR chromatic aberration to create a distortion underwater. To create movement within the scene, I used a two-tone camera and a focus pull that went from the foreground to the midground as the scene played out. This did not work as well as I had hoped, and so if I was to do this again, I think I would stick to a one-tone camera to have the scene move in one direction only rather than travelling around the scene. The next scene I made was a forest. I first created a sketch of roughly what I wanted the scene to look like, though it changed quite a bit through the process. I was inspired by an animation by Lap Pung Chung called Through the Tranquil Forest, where a boy is walking through the forest, and I decided to include the green-purple tints into my own colour grade. As I had wanted to focus on lighting in the different scenes, I researched how light was usually seen in forests. I found that the light seeps through the trees similar to how light comes through waves in the sea, so I tried to use the curtain filter again, though this time it did not work as well. Instead, I used a mask of a pale yellow opaque colour on the areas that I wanted the light to fall, and I felt that this worked well. I created the scene using, once again, layers from ED films and also photos with a transparent background from textures.com. I decided to have an object to focus on in this scene, as I felt this was something I lacked in the underwater one. So I chose a mushroom. In Lisa Puss's book, Digital Imaging in Popular Cinema, she says that a protagonist in a film is a figure in a landscape that commands our attention. So in my short moving scene, I had the mushroom in order to show the audience what to focus on. Although it was not a protagonist, it was still the main element of the film, as a protagonist would be. I chose to have the camera moving through the scene to be able to see some of the details further back. I felt this worked well, though I wish I could have worked with higher quality images, as the trees especially looked grainy when the camera moved towards them. The next scene I created was a sky scene where I had lots of clouds. I started off with a sketch for this scene too. I decided to make the scene take place during a sunset so that I could experiment more with the colours and lighting in this scene. I was heavily inspired by a scene from The Handmaiden, where the sky takes up most of the shot and is very colourful because of the sunset taking place. I used a tricolour effect on the clouds to make them appear different shades of pink and orange, as they would be in a sunset due to the lighting. I felt this worked well, though I wish I had been able to find flatter clouds to use for the background. I had just flattened the clouds myself and found that, though it looked fine, I knew it could have looked better with cloud layers designed specially. I also used a one-tone camera movement in the scene, moving along the clouds, so it looked like the clouds were moving left due to a wind. Next time I would love to try experimenting with different types of sky, for example raining or snowing. The next scene I created was a city scene. I once again used a sketch to start. When considering light, I had to make sure the light was falling onto the buildings from the same direction and casting shadows the same way. Therefore, if a building I had chosen reflected light in the opposite direction, I had to flip it horizontally. For the scene, I used photos of buildings that I had found online. I couldn't find any with a transparent background, and so I had to rotoscope the buildings from each photograph that I wanted to use. It was very time consuming as I wanted the buildings to look as realistic as possible. However, I think the end result was very effective. I feel that having a building in front and then moving the camera along to reveal the rest of the scene worked well, as it guided the audience to what they should be focusing on. I could have improved the scene by fine-tuning some of the rotoscoping, especially on the balconies of the buildings in the foreground. As well as this, I would love to make the scene more realistic by creating blocks of buildings with streets, so it looked like a real town. I would have to research a lot more images in order to be able to do this effectively. For my last scene, a desert, I wanted to incorporate all the different effects from the previous scenes that were effective. I began once again with a sketch. I was inspired by trips that I had taken to the Galapagos Islands, Egypt and Dubai. I found some images I wanted to use online and then used rotoscoping to gather the images together into realistic layers. I also had to make sure the light was falling onto the mountains from the same direction and looked good. I once again chose to have a focus in the scene as I had done with the mushroom in the forest, as I felt this had been effective, so I chose a cactus. I then colour graded all the layers so they had a warm orange tone to them, as they would in a desert, and faded out the layers in the background, which is what I found happened in photographs of the desert, due to the sound in the air making them appear less visible. Lastly, I added some specks of sand to float through the screen, as the one-tone camera moved into it to reveal all the layers closer up. I also added a lens dirt filter to make it appear as though the sun was slightly catching the edge of the camera lens, like a subtle lens flare. From this project, I learnt the importance of organisation when working on projects with many layers. My forest project was very messy as I had not labelled my layers properly, so I got confused very quickly, though I learned from this when creating my next scenes. I had barely used After Effects before this project, so almost anything I experimented was new and taught me something else. For example, I learned that light cannot always be portrayed in the same way digitally as it appears in real life. For example, the curtain filter worked for the underwater scene, but I had to use the pale yellow adjustment layer for the forest scene, even though in real life these two types of light looks very similar. So the same effect does not always work for all scenes. Next time, I would love to incorporate Maya into my project, perhaps creating my own moving layers instead of using ones from ED Films. As well as this, in another post-production lecture, we experimented with adding an animated fish to our underwater scene. So perhaps I could add more of these animals to my scenes, a sloth in the forest or a camel in the desert, for example. In Aaron Denor's book, The Filmmaker's Guide to Visual Effects, he says that VFX artists constantly strive to make their work as photoreal as possible. I would love to experiment with making my scenes look even more realistic so that they could be mistaken for a real camera shot in a film. As this was one of the first times I was experimenting with After Effects in depth, this allowed me to play around with colour grades and adding many different types of moving and unmoving layers to a sequence. I feel that I have improved greatly in After Effects and I am now confident with creating scenes with camera movement. I found that the camera movement and focus pause that I added made the scenes come alive and look like they could be in a real film or animation. It made it more interesting and engaging for the audience too. I would love to further develop my skills in After Effects by perhaps focusing on one of the scenes I had created and experimenting with colour grading and lighting the scene in different ways. Now that I'm more confident with After Effects, I feel that I could also begin to create scenes from my imagination, rather than just scenes that exist in real life, for example a planet with alien life forms or an alternate universe. Overall, I feel that this experimental project went well, though there is still room for me to improve and experiment with elements from each scene that I created.